Well, good afternoon, everybody, and good afternoon to those of you who are watching live. As county attorney, as you know, I review all investigations in which a first responder is directly involved in a shooting or in custody death. I review these investigations to determine whether this office will pursue a criminal prosecution. Like any case that this office pursues or reviews, this requires me to consider whether a crime occurred, and if so, whether there is a reasonable likelihood of conviction at trial. On September 24th, 2022, the Phoenix Police Department responded to a scene where a man was throwing large river rocks near the light rail into the street at passing motorists near 19th Avenue in Glendale in Phoenix. Tragically, this ended in the death of Ali Osman. In this particular matter, a comprehensive legal analysis took place in my office regarding the actions of both Mr. Osman and the responding officers. As prosecutors, we look at the facts and evidence in each case and determine if criminal charges are warranted based on the law. We do not review the case to determine if administrative policies were followed. We follow the law. The question in this case was whether the officer's decision to shoot was justified under Arizona law. And let me direct you to some of the applicable statutes. They include ARS 13404, 405, 406, 409, 410, and 411. These laws say that a person is legally justified in using deadly force when that person believes that it is necessary to defend themselves or a third person from the use of deadly physical force. The law also specifically states that a person has no duty to retreat before using deadly physical force under these circumstances. The law does not require a person using deadly physical force to prove their conduct was justified. Rather, the law requires the state to prove the person's conduct was not justified under the law beyond a reasonable doubt. The river rocks being thrown by Mr. Osman on that day posed a serious threat to every motorist and pedestrian in that area. Just last month, a young woman in Colorado lost her life under such circumstances. The officers had to work quickly to address the situation and stop the dangerous behavior. As the officers approached him with weapons drawn while ordering him to drop the rocks, he continued to throw rocks directly at them. They were so large and thrown with such force that one actually pierced the metal hood of an officer's SUV, and another broke the spotlight attached to the driver's side of the second police SUV. So I'm putting some pictures up there. If we can go back, please. So this is one of the rocks that was gathered at the scene. This rock, item marked as item 12, was the circumference long to short was 12 by 9 inches.
And do we know if that was thrown while they were driving?
We do not know specifically what rock was thrown, which one impacted, but that was one of the rocks that was found at the scene on the light rail station, which is right there. We don't know, and I would make the point that's kind of the point, because the proof is not on the person who would be charged. The person is on me to prove, for example, that this wasn't thrown. If we can go to the next scene. This is the officer's hood, and you can see that the metal is compromised there. And then the third picture. As you can see from the top on the right picture, the spotlight is broken out of its casing and is dangling, and you can see the damage that's done in the lower right-hand picture. When the officers approached him, Mr. Osman had a rock in his hand, ready to throw it directly at the officer. When the officer made the decision to shoot, and that decision was a reasonable one based on the force that Mr. Osman had used against them and was continuing to use. These rocks could easily have caused a crash, gone through the window of a vehicle, or caused serious physical injury or even death if they struck an officer or bystander. The officers took swift action to deal with the danger that his actions posed to the safety of the community. Therefore, I will not be seeking criminal charges against the officers in this matter. That said, my deepest sincerity goes out to Mr. Osman's family. This is undoubtedly the most traumatic thing that they have ever encountered, and my heart goes out to them. With that, I'll answer your questions.
We've seen other cities and county attorneys, charge officers in cases more recently. Tell me, what is the bar, the threshold? What would it have taken for you to charge?
What it takes is, it's the same standard that we use in every other case, reasonable likelihood of conviction. The question would be, is there a reasonable likelihood that a jury looking at the law, and keep in mind, the jury is going to be instructed, here's the law that you are to follow. If the jury looking at the law would find unanimously, beyond a reasonable doubt, that what these officers did under these circumstances was not reasonable or justified. And in those situations, as you know, recently we have charged some officers.
Some might look at this video and say that officers could have de-escalated this situation. What do you make of that?
I'm a huge proponent of de-escalation training, and anything I could do to insist with that, I would be happy to do and use this office for. But that said, when you're looking at an individual case, it's not about what I wish could have happened or would have been the outcome of this. It's under these set of circumstances that I'm given that have already occurred, what does the law tell me? And so looking at this case, we do believe that there is not a reasonable likelihood of conviction under the law with these set of circumstances. That said, I still am a huge proponent of de-escalation training.
County Attorney Mitchell, when you make these charging decisions, do you factor in what happens before or after the shooting? I'll give you a couple examples in this case. Before the officer drives off to encounter Mr. Osman, he says, let's get this MFer. And then he speeds up, immediately jumps out of his car. And then they wait 2 minutes before rendering aid on the back end. And there's also the fact that they had less lethal shotguns and they called for the police helicopter that they didn't wait for. All of those factors, that might weigh into this. Yes. I guess I'm curious how you weighed those when you made this decision.
I did weigh them. I looked at the entire length of the body cams, and I did hear that comment, as well as another officer respond, yes, I believe, to it.
How did you think through that?
How did I what?
Think through that, them saying, let's go get this MFer.
I think it's just part of the total package in terms of mindset, et cetera. And obviously, I don't condone any sort of unprofessional behavior. But the question is, the way our law is written, once that decision is made and they put themselves in the situation that they did, which was reasonable that they hurried to stop the threat to motorists, did his actions then justify doing what they did? And I think that there is not a jury that will unanimously find that that happened.
Did you get the sense that they rushed there to stop the threat to motorists? Or did you get the sense they rushed there because they had a rock hit their own car? Or do you differentiate between the two?
I can't get into their mindset, but what I can look at is whether it is justified and reasonable to stop that type of behavior, and it certainly is. That's, as you know, it's a very heavily traveled street. There's a lot of motorists. There's a light rail there. There is definitely a concern. As I pointed out just last month, somebody was killed in Colorado, a 20-year-old girl.
You took 2 Phoenix officers to a grand jury recently involved in that QT incident.
Yes.
Why not take this case to a grand jury and let them decide?
The grand jury standard, which is required under our law, that we take a case and show probable cause either to a grand jury or a judge in a preliminary hearing, is one part of due process. But the standard that we use for charging before we even get to that point is whether we think there is a reasonable likelihood of conviction. Now, sometimes the grand jury and the prosecutor's office disagree. But in that case, we did think there was perhaps a reasonable likelihood. In this case, we do not believe that there is a reasonable likelihood.
So it wasn't worth taking it. if you did want to
I would
pursue-
not use the word worse, taking it. This is a man's life, and I take it very seriously.
His family is moving forward with a lawsuit.
Mhm.
Tell me, if they were gonna say that this was not justified, what is your message to them?
My message to them is just one human being to another, that I am extremely sorry for what they've gone through. Obviously, that's a different part of our system, our court system. It's a different standard. And it has to be devastating to them what happened.
It seems like Phoenix Police has a new proposed use of force policy, and I think one of their sections, they say, only authorize force when reasonable, necessary, and proportional. Do you believe the force in this case was reasonable, necessary, and proportional?
I think under the law, it was reasonable and justified. I don't know how they're defining proportional. I'm not looking at their policy again. I'm not looking at this administratively. I'm looking at the law. And I think when somebody is throwing rocks at you that are big enough to cut metal, that it justifies what happened.
I want to ask you, you obviously deal with police a lot, right? They go out and make the arrests that lead to the probable cause that come to your office.
Yes.
Do you feel like the officers who pulled the trigger in this case should continue to be Phoenix police officers?
I know that the Phoenix Police Department is ongoing with their administrative review of this, and I'm going to let them answer that question. That is outside my role, and it's within the purview also of AZ Post. My role is to look and see whether criminal charges are appropriate.
We know you have a review board that goes over these cases. Remind me how many people are on that?
There's probably, I haven't counted lately, there's over 20 people that are part of that review board.
Did any dissent and say, I think we should, dissent, I use that word lightly, did anyone say, hey, I think we should charge these officers or at least take it to a grand jury?
While I don't discuss what the advice is coming to me, what I will tell you is that there was a vigorous discussion. It was thoroughly weighed, and I took a lot of time looking at this case, looking over this case. I don't merely take recommendations, I look through it myself, and this is my decision.
And what were you reviewing exactly? I know usually the police department will submit their own sort of investigation, or sometimes they bring in like an independent, a different agency to investigate it. What did you have in front of you, given that the administrative review is on?
So what we have includes all the body-worn cams that are relevant. We have scene photos, we have police reports, we have, in certain situations, including this one, an autopsy report. We have interviews of the witnesses on scene at the time. It may be that we have drone footage of the scene to give perspective, measurements. We have a summary initially, but all of that is available to the entire committee that you referenced, Zach, to look at. Jimmy?
What were the potential charges that you were thinking of?
Well, I mean, if somebody kills somebody without justification, obviously you're looking toward the homicide charges. So, wherever it would fall within that spectrum of charges, from negligent homicide, manslaughter on up to first and second degree murder.
Okay, and the lowest of those is?
Negligent homicide.
Okay, and so you looked at negligent homicide and you said, we don't think this is gonna clear that bar.
Correct.
Okay, and what are some factors that would clear a bar in negligent homicide?
Well, negligent homicide, keep in mind, is basically failing to perceive a risk and that resulting in the death. So I don't see that as necessarily being the situation here, failing to perceive a risk. But I mean, it's a whole matter, but regardless, you're still looking at whether they have a defense under these statutes. And keep in mind, the defense is not something, and this is very important to note, the defense is not something where they have to come forward and prove their defense. The defense is such that when they raise it, I have to disprove it beyond a reasonable doubt to a unanimous jury. And I think that's something that's very important for people to understand, the way our law is written.
So you think that he reasonably perceived that there was a threat of the officer's life and responded accordingly?
I think when he saw, well, first of all, he knew what the individual was doing toward cars. Secondly, you can see in the body cam the rocks coming at them. Third, you can see the damage that they caused.
At what point does
You know, what I would say is this, you're not just, you're looking at, well, that's not as bad, so maybe that, since there was a threat. But that's not how the law is written. The way the law is written is there are defenses to criminal acts. And if those defenses are present, that they can be argued, can I disprove those defenses? Can I prove that what they did was not reasonable, not justified, beyond a reasonable doubt? And the answer in this case is no, because of what he was doing.
And do you consider the fact that some might say, and there are laws about officers putting themselves in reasonable harm, right? They can't jump out in front of a moving car and then shoot the driver and say, you know, I feared for my life, right? Because they jumped in front of the car.
Right.
In this case, they had 3 officers.
Right.
He didn't wait for one of them with a less lethal shotgun to get out of his car before pulling the trigger. 3 versus 1, they could have pulled the cars up, they could have blocked traffic to keep other motorists safe. There were other tactics. Did that factor into it at all? That had they done things differently, they likely may not have needed to use deadly force?
You know, I think every case should be looked at for exactly what you're saying, is could things have been done differently that everybody would have gone home that night? But in this case, like I said, I don't get to stand here and say, I wish this would have happened, or if this had happened, maybe this would happen. My role is to look at what did happen and compare it to the law and say, does what happened fall under the law such that there is a chargeable case or that there is a viable defense?
We see the city settle so many of these cases, right? Antonio Arce, you know, Ryan Whitaker, to name a few, to the tune of millions of dollars. And it feels like that's an admission of, you know, we didn't follow policy. How do you weigh that a lot of times families say, I didn't care about the money. I wanted the person who took my loved one's life held accountable in a court of law. That's justice to them. I mean, obviously that's your goal, is to seek justice. How do you say to the families that don't see it the same way?
You know, I would expect them to say that their loved one was more important to them than the money. But that does not change the fact that we have a law that talks about this. And if people are concerned about, you know, the way the law is written, then the law needs to be changed. But the law right now says that you don't have to retreat. And if it is reasonable, given the threat, that you are able to use deadly physical force as a police officer. That's what happened.
What do you hope Valley Police Department's learned from this shooting?
Well, I won't focus on this particular shooting in specifically, but in general, as I said, I think that de-escalation training is extremely important. We put a lot on our police officers in terms of dealing with people who are suffering mental health issues, who are suffering drug addictions, or maybe a combination thereof. And I think de-escalation training is extremely important. In fact, I've attended some of the classes at the academy just to see what they are given, but you really can't have too much.
Did you speak with this family? Are they aware? How do they feel about it?
I have offered to speak with his family. I will be speaking to the lawyer who represents the family this afternoon.
I know we had a bunch of other questions, so just maybe if there is one more question on the Osman case. If not, I know other folks have things to ask.
Okay, go for it.
Rachel, my questions have to do with the Lori Vallow case. Obviously, she was convicted of murdering her kids in Idaho last Friday. It is a national story, as you know, with the roots stemming right here in Arizona. What will the extradition process look like for her? I know your statement said it could take up to several months to get her back here. Is that normal compared to other cases involving extradition?
You know, it varies depending on whether the person waives extradition or fights extradition. So we're also waiting, of course, in Idaho for that process to be completed. And so that's probably a fair assessment that it would take a couple of months or more.
But as quick as weeks, possibly? Maybe several weeks?
We're acting as quickly as we can, and we'll see how fast their process goes, and that we can do that, yes.
Are your prosecutors working with Chandler and Gilbert Police to charge others possibly involved in the murder of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux, or is Lori Vallow the lone defendant, do you foresee?
We've reviewed the entire case, and we're always looking for additional evidence, but at this point, I'm not going to talk more about that than say that.
Well, your office did decline to prosecute her husband, Chad Daybell, yet his name is mentioned all over the police reports for Gilbert and Chandler. You know, there was so much evidence that came out in the trial, it's sort of a preview. Well, why not prosecute him or take another look?
We're always open to taking another look as more information becomes available to us. And that, you know, typically in the lifetime of a case, as it goes to trial, stuff does come up, information does come up. So we are open to looking at that.
Family members of Charles Vallow believe, you know, Chandler PD could have done more to make an arrest in his murder before Lloyd moved to Idaho. It was about 2 months of time. And ultimately preventing the murders of her children. I know hindsight is 20/20, but do you think a trial here would be redemption for law enforcement in some way?
Well, you mean if we go to trial versus?
Having a trial here for her for the murder of Charles Vallow. Her family believes that police basically dropped the ball for the 2 months that she was here in the valley and then she fled to Idaho. And they now say that she was pretty suspicious in the beginning, but there was no arrest of her brother who shot and killed Charles, and he claimed self-defense at the time. So
Obviously, we're looking at a case as it comes before us and what the appropriate thing is to do in that case. And if that gives them, you know, peace of mind, and I hope it does, although it'll never make up for the loss of their loved one, then I'm glad for that.
she faces life in prison in Idaho, but what is your message to taxpayers here who may say, why even extradite her? Why is prosecuting her important to you in your office?
Well, kind of for what you just asked me about having the victims recognized as victims, to give people a voice, to hold people accountable for what they've done.
Just to be clear, she would be sentenced before an extradition would happen, right?
Yes.
I want to piggyback off his question about the 2 months thing and the investigation that was done with her brother. You know, it feels like in the interview with Chandler detectives and Vallow's brother, who's now dead, that there were clear red flags in both their stories, inconsistencies, in addition to her going to Burger King after taking her kids to school and acting like nothing was wrong, that police should have jumped quicker, and the question of how involved were your prosecutors in your office, although maybe you weren't county attorney at the time, I know that there should have been or let me phrase it this way. How quickly did you guys get involved in reviewing the evidence in this case, specifically the claims of self-defense?
As soon as the case was brought to our attention, we assigned a prosecutor to the case, but beyond that, I'm not going to go into it because this is a pending case. It's a very serious case, and I don't want to comment on it. Obviously, there's a difference between what we do and what the police do. We don't investigate, but it's important for us to be brought up to speed so that we know what's going on.
And will you be handling those cases together in the same trial? They will be separate?
That will be a matter left up to the courts and the prosecutor.
If she was convicted here in the county, would she serve prison time here in Arizona or just head back to Idaho? How would that work?
Typically, the way it works is after the conviction here, they go back to the state that they came from, or that they were sentenced in first.
Have you followed the case very heavily, would you say? It's been 3.5 years. What do you think?
What do I think? I'm not going to comment on that. It's a pending case, and that's what I think. And I'm going to treat it with the respect it deserves and not comment on the evidence.
What's the importance of bringing her back here to face charges if she is sentenced to life behind bars in Idaho?
Just like I said, holding people accountable for what they've done, giving the victims a voice, giving victims recognition of what happened. So it's very important.
Can you answer why Zion Teasley, the suspect in the Rachel Heike murder, was offered a plea deal in 2020 robbery case that dismissed 10 charges, kidnapping charges, robbery-related charges, and allowed him to serve just 1.5 years in prison for the 3 charges? And was he being monitored at the time of Rachel's death?
If we were in court, I would say that was a compound question, but let me make sure I can answer all the parts of it. As far as whether he was being monitored, that is a question that I would direct you to adult probation for. As far as the plea agreement that he entered into in 2021, that's a really good question. And I'm looking into that myself and reviewing the case.
What have you come up with so far?
I'm going to review the whole case before I finalize my thoughts on that. Just he received 3 years in prison. It was shortened because he did have credit for time served, which is mandatory that they get that. But I am looking into that.
This obviously happened under your predecessor. Tell me, how would you have handled the case differently now if this were to come before you?
I need to review it in its entirety before I comment on that.
What specifically will you be looking at?
Mostly the police reports, and then wherever that leads me, if I need to look at videos or whatever, pictures, I will look at that.
Her family and neighbors are gonna hear this, they're gonna be outraged. What's your message to them?
You know, I've already spoken to her mom the other day, and it's just a needless and senseless tragedy that they've gone through. So I'm going to do my due diligence in looking up, make sure that things were handled as they should have been. If they were, okay, but if they were not, then I need to, as now the county attorney, to make changes.
Would you, I guess, offer, or would you encourage your assistant county attorneys to offer a plea deal in a situation like this? Would you, if, now knowing what you know about it, would you handle it the same?
You know, hindsight's, you're talking about if I'd offer a plea agreement. Obviously, that changes everything. Hindsight is 20/20, and I'm not going to put that on prosecutors to hold them responsible for every possible thing that can happen after they handle a case. That would not be fair. It would not be possible. It wouldn't be humanly possible to anticipate everything that's going to happen. But that said, I'm still going to look at this case.
County Attorney, I think we told you we were going to ask about this, the Goodyear cycling crash that killed 2 people, injured many others in February. What's
Yep.
the latest update on that case? It's my understanding that he was never actually formally charged because you furthered the case back.
Right.
So where do you stand? Have you gotten anything back from Goodyear?
We're in constant contact with them about the case, but no, it's still in a further status where we sent it back to them for additional investigation.
Do you check in, or does your office check in with Goodyear PD regularly to kind of ask what's the status of that? And, you know, a lot of people impacted, particularly victims, feel like if someone is not in jail, or if they're not bonded out or monitored, that there's A, the risk they could flee, and B, that they haven't really been held accountable. Do you feel that same sense of urgency to get that case back from Goodyear, or is it kind of like, hey, you do the investigation, when you get it to us, you get it to us?
You know, after prosecuting for 30 years, I'll tell you this, I would rather have a thorough, good investigation than a quick one. And because in the long run, that's going to enable me to better hold the person accountable and make sure that justice is done.
All right, last question.
Why further it in the first place? Is that an indictment on the investigation that was done initially?
Not at all. They, I think, recognized it. I'll refer you back to the police chief's press conference that he held, and he readily acknowledged that there were some things that they did not know, and they're critical for us to know before we go ahead with charges. They understood that. We were giving them the time to do the investigation. There's no animus there toward the Goodyear PD.